All right, so now we're going to move on to women and equal rights. So the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 really was the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. Which of course scored a great victory with the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920, where women gained the right to vote. Now, there were some other events, other major events that occurred during this women's rights movement. You had the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, in 1972. This stated that the equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged or denied by the U.S. or any state on account of sex. However, this amendment failed. And with Roe v. Wade in 1973, women gained the freedom to choose an abortion during the first trimester of pregnancy. Now let's take a look at women and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There are various parts of the Civil Rights Act that very much have applied to women and women's rights. Title VII is big. It prohibits gender discrimination in employment. It has been extended to sexual harassment as well. The Civil Rights Act also talked about comparable worth, equal pay for equal work. And another major part of the Civil Rights Act was Title IX, which provided equal funding for all programs that received federal funding. And oftentimes you will hear Title IX being mentioned in context of men's versus women's sports and how each type of sport must get equal federal funding. All right, so let's take a look at rights for older Americans. Age discrimination is illegal, mostly based on the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, which protected people 40 and over from age discrimination. It also raised the general compulsory retirement age to 70. And the AARP is a major interest group that has a very large influence that fights for elderly rights. All right, so we're going to move on to the homosexual rights movement here. I'm going to talk about some major events in the homosexual rights movement. So in 1993, you have Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This referred to gay rights to be in the military. This basically said that soldiers were not supposed to tell if they were homosexual. That's the don't tell part. And then you have the don't ask part, which is that military supervisors were not to ask their soldiers if they were homosexual. That's the don't ask part. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was ended under the Obama administration. You have Lawrence versus Texas in 2003. This said that the law against homosexual action violated the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. And in that decision, Anthony Kennedy talks about how it takes away life, liberty, and property. Then in 2015, you have Obergefell versus Hodges, which stated that the right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples via the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, let's go to disabled Americans here. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was big, made it illegal to discriminate based on disability. You have the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which protected disabled rights. Now, the Supreme Court has somewhat limited this act. All right, now let's look at reverse discrimination. And the big question here lies in equality of opportunity versus equality of results. Do civil rights require the absence of discrimination, or do they require a racial balance. And there's a couple of major court cases here. Probably the biggest one is University of California versus Bach in 1978, which said that strict quotas were unconstitutional. So a quota is saying we want this many people of this race to be in our university. That was considered unconstitutional, but it also said that race can be a criteria for admission to a public institution. Now, the Supreme Court later on, if actually in 2014, stated that bans on using race as a criteria are okay. That was in Shute versus the Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action. All right, so let's look at the assessment. Describe for me, for number one, what the 14th Amendment has to do with civil rights. Then go ahead and describe one piece of legislation or a Supreme Court case that has influenced the civil rights of A, for African Americans, B, for women, and C, for disabled Americans. And we'll move on to the summary. So in a paragraph, we're going to describe what you have learned today. Have a good one. Bye-bye.